The dress had taken 43 nights to finish. Josie knew this because she had counted every single one of them. Each night her mother bent over the small wooden table near the window, nimble fingers guiding the needle by the trembling light of a tallow candle, stitching patience into every seam as though she were sewing hope directly into the fabric. By the standards of the Great Gathering, it was a simple dress. No gold embroidery, no stones imported from the Southern Territories. But it was cream and clean, with delicate lace along the sleeves and a narrow satin ribbon at the waist that caught Josie's shape in a way few garments ever had. Her mother had said, pressing the final pins into place, that any wolf worth his eyes would notice her that night. Josie had believed that. She had believed a great many things back then. The stone hall of the Vornath pack was decorated as it was only once every 3 years, when the full moon cycle aligned with the bonding season and the alphas of every pack across the territory gathered for the mating ball. Enormous torches burned in wrought iron brackets along the dark stone walls, throwing gold shadows over the clan banners that hung from ceiling to floor. The black wolf of Vornath, the silver wolf of Ashenvale, the red wolf of Drakmore, and at the center, larger than all the others, the black and white standard of the royal pack, the two-toned wolf that belonged to the Alpha King, the one who ruled every wolf territory on the continent. There were rumors the king would come this time. There were always rumors like that, and most of the time they proved false. Josie was not thinking about the king as she crossed the main corridor with Preya at her side. Preya, who had been her closest friend since childhood, daughter of a blacksmith, Omega like her, with copper hair pinned in a crooked bun, and a green dress she had dyed herself with herbs from the garden behind their row of cottages. The two of them knew precisely where they stood in that hall. Low-born Omegas sat at the side tables, helped themselves last from the trays of bread and roasted meat, and waited patiently for some wolf of reasonable standing to consider glancing in their direction. It was the natural order of things, as the pack elder always said, as it had always been. But this time was different for Josie. This time, there was a promise. Dorian Ashvale had promised her. Not with grand words or public gestures. Dorian was a subtle wolf, the son of Vornath's chief advisor, of middling status, but with enough ambition to want a quiet, steady Omega at his side. He had whispered the promise into Josie's ear 3 weeks earlier, while the two of them walked through the orchard behind the stone keep, and she had felt the warmth of those words settle into her chest like a glowing ember. At the ball, I will introduce you to my family. I will choose you before the pack. Simple words. Words that, for an Omega with no name and no status, were worth more than silver. She had sewn this dress alongside her mother, believing in those words. The hall smelled of burning resin, tallow wax, cured leather, and the sweet-spiced perfume of mulled wine that servants distributed in dark ceramic jugs. At least 200 wolves filled the space, alphas and betas from neighboring packs, women in gowns stitched with silver thread, men in heavy cloaks bearing clan insignias embroidered at the shoulder. The noise of voices and lute music filled the vaulted stone ceiling, rising and folding back down in warm, amber-lit waves. Josie found Dorian near the central table, as they had agreed. He was different. Not different in any obvious, transformed way, but in his posture. There was something tight and evasive in the way his eyes refused to land directly on hers. Beside him stood a woman Josie had never seen before. Tall, with dark hair arranged in elaborate braids, wearing a gown embroidered in gold thread that immediately announced noble origin. The daughter of Lord Ashenvale, Josie would understand moments later, when the woman's father approached and greeted Dorian with the easy familiarity of two men who had already settled their agreements in private rooms. Dorian. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. He finally looked at her, and in that look was the answer to everything that had not yet been spoken aloud. Josie. He lowered his voice as though trying to make the conversation small, invisible, something that could dissolve into the noise of the hall without leaving a mark. Circumstances have changed. My father and Lord Ashenvale have reached an arrangement. It is a matter of alliance between the packs. You understand." She understood, yes. She understood every syllable of what he was not saying along with what he was. She understood that the 43 nights her mother had bent over that table near the window meant nothing to this man. She understood that the satin ribbon at her waist and the lace at her sleeves were invisible to eyes that had already decided to look elsewhere. She understood that she was being dismissed with the kind of calm, almost apologetic tone that men reserved for situations they considered minor inconveniences, a borrowed tool being returned, a minor debt being quietly forgiven. "Of course," she said, because what else was there to say? Dorian's shoulders relaxed almost immediately with visible relief, and he turned back to the dark-haired woman at his side, as though Josie had already ceased to exist. The woman had not even glanced at her. Neither had Lord Ashenvale. She was not worth the acknowledgement of being looked at directly. Priya appeared at Josie's elbow within seconds, her green eyes sharp and furious in a way that her voice was carefully not. "Don't," Josie said quietly, before her friend could speak. I know what he just did. In front of everyone, Josie." Half the hall was watching that table. Josie kept her chin level. She was aware, in a way that sat somewhere between humiliation and something harder and colder underneath it, that several wolves nearby had indeed witnessed the exchange. She had seen 2 beta women near the wine table turn away with the particular speed of people pretending not to have seen something. She had seen a young alpha from Drakmore lean toward his companion and say something low, and his companion had smiled the wrong kind of smile. The heat behind her eyes was there. She refused to let it become anything more than heat. "I'm going to step outside for a moment," she told Priya. "I'll come with you." "No, stay. I just need a moment of cold air." She moved toward the far end of the hall, keeping her pace unhurried, her spine straight, her hands loose at her sides. She would not rush. She would not give any wolf in that room the satisfaction of watching her flee. The stone floor was cold through the thin soles of her shoes, and the torchlight made the shadows around her long and strange. She was almost at the side corridor that led to the outer passage when she became aware of a shift in the hall behind her. Not a sound, exactly. More like a pressure. The music slowed without stopping. The voices did not silence themselves but dropped, collectively, half a register. The particular hush of a large room becoming suddenly alert. Josie paused without meaning to, her hand 2 inches from the stone wall of the archway. She turned. 3 men had entered through the main doors. The first was broad-shouldered and fair-haired, with a grin already curving his mouth as he scanned the hall with the easy confidence of someone who had never once doubted his welcome. The second was leaner, darker, with sharp cheekbones and an expression of refined amusement, as though everything he was looking at was mildly entertaining in a way he hadn't quite decided whether to acknowledge. Both of them wore the black and silver riding cloaks of the royal territory. The third man walked slightly behind the other 2, and he was the reason the hall had gone quiet. He was tall in a way that the room seemed to acknowledge before the eye fully processed it. Not the exaggerated height of someone trying to impose, but the natural, settled height of a man who had never needed to try. His hair was long and braided back in dark plaits, pulled away from a face that was angular and still, with pale eyes that moved across the hall with the calm, measuring attention of someone taking inventory rather than seeking entertainment. He wore leather armor strapped with broad belts across the chest, a heavy fur mantle across his shoulders, and at his side, a sword that was not decorative. There were faint scars along his forearms where the leather bracers did not cover. He was not smiling. He did not need to. Every alpha in the hall had straightened. Every pack leader near the central table had turned. Lord Ashenvale had gone very still with a cup halfway to his mouth. Josie watched from the archway as the fair-haired man said something to the dark one and laughed, and the dark one responded with a dry half-smile, and neither of them looked at the third man, because looking at him, she understood instinctively, was something you did carefully, and not for long. The Alpha King had come after all, and in the precise moment that Josie registered this, still standing half in shadow at the edge of the hall, with her rejected dress and her careful, controlled expression. The pale eyes of Kale, Alpha King of all wolf territories, lord of the black and white banner, crossed the length of the room and stopped on her. Not on the gold-embroidered gown of Lord Ashenvale's daughter, not on the silver-threaded women near the wine table, not on any of the carefully presented high-born Omegas who had spent weeks preparing for this exact moment. On her. For exactly 3 seconds, which was long enough to make Josie's breath hold itself without her permission, those pale eyes rested on her face with an attention that felt like a hand pressing flat against the center of her chest. Then one of his companions said his name, and the moment broke, and Kale looked away. Josie turned and walked out into the cold passage, her heart knocking against her ribs with a rhythm that had nothing to do with Dorian Ashvale, and everything to do with something she did not yet have a name for. Outside, the night air smelled like rain and pine and wet earth. She stood in it for a long time. The cold did not help the way Josie had hoped it would. She stood in the outer passage for several minutes, her back against the stone wall, the night air pressing against her face like a firm, indifferent hand. Beyond the narrow window slit above her head, the forest stretched dark and deep in every direction. The ancient pine woods that surrounded the Vornath keep like a held breath, their crowns barely visible against a sky thick with clouds. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled once and went quiet. The sound settled into the night and disappeared. She pressed her palms flat against the cold stone behind her and concentrated on the sensation. He looked at you because you were standing in a doorway and doorways catch the eye, she told herself. He looked at you the way anyone looks at movement in their periphery. It meant nothing. You are a low-born Omega from the edge of Vornath territory with a handmade dress and no clan name worth speaking, and the Alpha King did not look at you because he saw anything. He looked at you because eyes move. This was a reasonable thing to tell herself. She believed approximately none of it. The stone door behind her pushed open, and Preya came through it with 2 cups of wine and the specific expression she wore when she had decided to ignore instructions given to her. I told you to stay inside, Josie said. I brought wine, which cancels out the ignoring. Preya pressed one of the cups into Josie's hand and leaned against the wall beside her, pulling her green skirt away from a puddle of rainwater near the base of the stones. Are you all right? I'm perfectly fine. You have the face you make when you're perfectly fine, and also furious, and also trying not to cry. I'm not going to cry over Dorian Ashvale. Good, because he absolutely does not deserve tears. He deserves something much less dignified, like a bucket of cold water dropped from a window. Preya sipped her wine with an expression of quiet satisfaction at this mental image. His new intended has a very sharp chin, by the way. I noticed it up close. Very sharp, like a decorative weapon. Despite everything, the corner of Josie's mouth moved. Stop, she said, but without heat. I'm simply making an observation. Preya was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted into something gentler. He was never right for you, Josie. Even before tonight I thought so. He always looked at you like you were something useful, rather than something wanted. Josie looked down at the cup in her hands. The wine was still warm, faintly sweet, with a note of clove underneath. Her mother had pressed a dried clove into Josie's palm before she left that evening. An old luck charm from their village, something grandmothers did before important nights. Josie had slipped it into the pocket of her dress without thinking, and she could feel it there now, small and hard against her thigh. The king came, she said. Preya went very still for exactly 1 breath. I know, she said. Half the hall collapsed inward when those doors opened. You could feel the weight of the room change. He's exactly what the stories say. He's more than what the stories say. The stories leave out the part where the air around him seems to have different rules. Preya paused. Did you see his companions? The fair one is Lord Caden Voss, second in command of the Royal Guard, apparently incapable of entering a room without immediately assessing which women are present. And the dark one is Commander Reth. They say he's never once smiled sincerely in his adult life, and that every smile he does produce is a warning sign. "Where did you learn all this?" I asked a servant. Servants know everything. Preya turned to look at her with an expression that was carefully calibrated somewhere between casual and pointed. "The king was looking at you. He wasn't. Josie, I was standing 12 feet away. He was looking at you." People look at doorways. People do not stop looking at doorways for 3 full seconds with that particular expression. Preya held up a hand to stop the objection already forming. "I'm not saying it means anything. I'm saying I saw it, and I'm not going to pretend I didn't, because I find that sort of pretending exhausting." Josie was quiet. The pine forest shifted in a low wind beyond the walls, and the distant sound of lutes drifted through the stone, muffled and warm. "Let's go back in," she said finally. "I'm not going to stand in the cold all night because Dorian Ashvale is a coward." "That's the spirit," said Preya, and meant it. The hall had rearranged itself in their absence. The central area near the great hearth had been cleared for what Josie recognized as the formal presentation, the portion of the mating ball where pack leaders brought forward their omegas for the ritual acknowledgement, the old ceremony of being seen. It was not a binding ritual, but it carried weight. To be presented and passed over was its own kind of public record. To be presented and claimed was something else entirely. Josie had expected to be presented alongside the other low-born omegas in the final grouping, the polite, pro forma gesture that allowed the ball to say it had included everyone. She found her place near Preya along the side wall, and watched as the high-born omegas were brought forward first, one by one, each one moving with the practiced ease of women who had been trained since childhood for precisely this kind of visibility. Lord Ashenvale's daughter moved with particular grace, and Josie saw Dorian watching her from near the hearth with an expression of careful, arranged admiration, the face of a man performing the emotion he was supposed to feel. She looked away from him. The Alpha King stood apart from the presentation, which was his right. He was not required to participate in any pack's formal ritual, and he had not moved toward the central floor. He stood instead near the tall windows at the far end of the hall, one shoulder against the stone frame, his pale eyes tracking the proceedings with the same measured, unhurried attention he seemed to apply to everything. Lord Caden Voss, the fair-haired one, had already migrated toward a group of women near the east table, and was doing something that appeared to involve a great deal of charm and very little subtlety. Commander Reth stood 3 steps behind the king and slightly to his left, still and watchful as a shadow. The low-born omegas were called forward near the end of the presentation. Josie moved into the loose group of 8 or 9 women, standing straight, hands clasped, reminding herself that she had done nothing to be ashamed of. The rejection had been Dorian's failing, not hers. She carried herself like someone who believed that, even when the believing was effortful. The pack elder moved along the small group with his ceremonial staff, speaking each name in a dry, uninflected tone that made every woman sound approximately equivalent to a line in an inventory ledger. When he reached Josie, he paused for half a second longer than he had with the others, not because of recognition or significance, but because he had to check his scroll for her name. "Josie of the Borderlands," he announced. "No clan affiliation. Omega of standard designation. Standard designation." She had always despised that phrase. She held her chin level and stared at the middle distance. What happened next did not begin loudly. It began as a shift in attention, the particular creak and adjustment of a large room turning its focus. Josie became aware of it first, as a sensation at the back of her neck, the specific warmth of being looked at from a distance, and then as a sound. The soft but unmistakable scuff of boot leather on stone, moving in her direction with an even, unhurried stride. She did not turn immediately. She waited, because she was not certain, and she did not want to be wrong about this in public. Then she heard Lord Caden Voss say, from somewhere behind her, and to the right, in a low, amused voice, "Well, that's interesting." And Commander Reth's voice, quieter, flat as a blade, "Don't." And then she turned. Kyle was crossing the hall. Not toward the central presentation floor, not toward the pack leaders assembled near the hearth, not toward any of the high-born Omegas who had been presented with elaborate ceremony. He was crossing the hall with the direct, unhesitating line of a man who had already decided where he was going, his pale eyes fixed on a point that resolved, as the distance closed, into Josie's face. The hall went quiet in the way it had when he entered, not all at once, but in a spreading wave, conversations cutting off, heads turning, the music stuttering to silence as the lute player registered the shift in atmosphere and made the instinctive decision to stop. Kyle stopped 3 feet in front of her. Up close, he was overwhelming in a way that had nothing to do with size, though he was large. It was the stillness of him, the absolute absence of performance or display, the sense that every bit of space he occupied was occupied deliberately, without waste. His pale eyes were a gray, so light it was almost silver, and they were looking at her with an expression she could not immediately name. Not pity, not the calculating assessment of a man pricing livestock. Something more careful than that. Something that looked almost, in its strange controlled way, like recognition. He said nothing for a moment. Around them, 200 wolves held their collective breath. Then Kale spoke, in a voice that was low and even, and carried without effort across the silent hall. "What is your name?" he said, as though the elder had not just announced it, as though he wanted to hear it from her. Josie's heart was somewhere in her throat. She kept her voice steady by sheer will. "Josie," she said, "of the borderlands." Something moved across his expression. The faintest shift, like light changing through a high window. "I know where you're from," he said quietly. "I've known that for longer than tonight." The silence in the hall had weight. Josie could feel it pressing against her skin the way heat presses from an open hearth. Not uncomfortable, but impossible to ignore. 200 wolves standing perfectly still, cups halfway raised, conversations severed mid-sentence. All of them watching the AlphaKing stand 3 feet in front of a no-name Omega from the borderlands and speak to her as though the rest of the room did not exist. She heard Preya somewhere behind her make a sound that was not quite a breath and not quite a word. "You've known that for longer than tonight," Josie repeated, keeping her voice level. "And yet we've never met." "No," Kyle said, "we haven't." "Then I'm not certain how you would know anything about me." Something shifted at the very edge of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the structural suggestion of one. As though the muscles remembered the motion, but were deciding whether the moment warranted it. "Your pack elder presented you as an Omega of standard designation, with no clan affiliation," he said. "That is what is written on his scroll." "It's accurate." "It isn't." The words were quiet, and entirely without drama, delivered the way a man states the temperature of water or the direction of wind. "What's written on that scroll is what someone decided to record 23 years ago when your mother arrived at the borderlands alone and didn't speak for 6 days. It reflects the record of an administration that didn't ask the right questions." The air in Josie's chest had gone strange. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she normally wasn't. A slow, insistent drumming that seemed too loud for the inside of her own body. "I don't understand what you're saying," she said. "I know." He looked at her with that careful, measuring attention that she was beginning to understand, was simply how he looked at things he considered important. "I'm not going to explain it here, in the middle of a hall, in front of people who haven't earned the information." The pale eyes held hers. "But I am asking you to trust that I'm not standing in front of you by accident." From somewhere to the right came Lord Caden Voss's voice, low and deliberately casual. He genuinely isn't, for what it's worth. He doesn't do anything by accident. It's exhausting to witness, honestly. Caden, Cale said, without looking away from Josie. Remaining quiet, said Caden, in the tone of a man who was doing no such thing internally. Commander Reth said nothing, which, Josie was beginning to understand, was Reth's version of contributing significantly. Josie looked at the man in front of her. She had been raised to be careful. Careful with hope. Careful with expectation. Careful with the particular vulnerability of wanting things from people who had not yet demonstrated they were worth wanting things from. She had believed Dorian Ashvale's whispered words in an orchard 3 weeks ago, and she had counted 43 nights of candlelight as a result. She was not inclined toward credulity tonight. "You're the Alpha King," she said. "You rule every wolf territory on this continent. You arrived at a mating ball held by a minor pack, walked past every high-born, carefully presented woman in this hall, and crossed the room to speak to an Omega whose name had to be read off a scroll." She kept her gaze steady. "You'll forgive me if I don't simply accept that as straightforward." This time the shift at the corner of his mouth completed itself. It was a brief thing, barely there, but it changed his face in a way that made him look, for one unguarded second, almost human in his amusement. "I don't expect you to accept anything," he said. "I'm asking for a conversation. 1 hour. The east corridor, away from the hall. You can bring your red-haired friend if it makes you more comfortable." "It's copper," Preya said immediately from behind Josie, and then, at a slightly lower volume, "Sorry." The clarification felt important. Josie did not look away from Cale. She thought about her mother bent over a small table for 43 nights. She thought about the dried clove in her pocket, and the particular, threadbare shape of hope that low-born Omegas learned to carry quietly, folded small enough that it didn't show. She thought about the way Dorian Ashvale's eyes had slid off her face like water off oiled leather, and she thought about the 3 seconds in the doorway, when these pale gray eyes had done the exact opposite. 1 hour, she said. The east corridor was long and torchlit, with a row of narrow windows on one side that looked out over the inner courtyard, where horses were stabled, and the smell of hay and cold stone drifted up in layers. Preya had come, as invited, and stationed herself at a pointed distance near the far window, with her cup of wine, and the expression of someone performing the act of not listening with great concentration. Caden Voss had somehow also materialized in the corridor, leaning against the wall near the entrance with his arms crossed, and a look on his face that suggested he was simply there by coincidence and had no particular interest in anything. Reth stood at the corridor entrance like a closed door given human form. Kyle stood near the second window, and Josie stood across from him, and the space between them was not large. "Your mother's name was Sarah," he said. Not a question. Josie went still. "Was," he noted. "I'm sorry. 3 winters ago." Her voice was even. "How do you know her name?" "Because her name appears in the Royal Archives under a lineage record that was sealed 40 years ago by my father's administration," Kyle said. "Sealed because the woman it belonged to, your grandmother, refused to submit to the consolidation order that brought the border packs under central authority. She dissolved her own clan record rather than hand it over. The royal house at the time decided it was easier to pretend the line had simply ended. The torchlight moved in a draft from somewhere above them. Josie's hands were very still at her sides. "What lineage?" she said. "Vial," he said. "The Vial bloodline, one of the 7 founding clans of the Wolf Territories." He watched her face carefully. "The reason every alpha in that hall shifted when you walked in and couldn't explain why. The reason your scent doesn't match your designation. The reason Dorian Ashvale's wolf recognized something his human mind was too compromised by social calculation to act on." The name Vial landed somewhere deep in Josie's chest and resonated there like a bell struck in an empty room. She had heard the name exactly once. Her mother, feverish and near the end, had said it in her sleep, in a voice that sounded like grief and like pride in equal measure. And Josie had assumed it was a dream fragment, the name of someone lost or remembered. She had not asked about it afterward, because there had been no afterward. Her mother was gone by morning. "Why are you telling me this here?" Josie said. "Tonight." "Because I've been waiting for the right moment for 2 years," Kyle said. "And when I watched you walk out of that hall with your spine straight and your face composed after what Ashvale did to you in front of half the gathered packs, I decided I was done waiting for a better one." The words settled in the corridor air with a weight that was different from flattery. There was no performance in them. He said them the way he said everything, directly, without decoration, as though the truth required no embellishment to be sufficient. 2 years, Josie said. "I first came across the sealed archive record 2 years ago. I had investigators try to trace the living line. It took time. Your mother had buried the connection carefully." A pause. "She was protecting you." "From what?" "From exactly the kind of attention you're receiving right now," he said, with a directness that acknowledged the irony without flinching from it. A woman with Vielle blood in an era when the founding clans are either absorbed or forgotten is either a political asset to someone or a political problem. Your mother understood that. She chose Borderlands anonymity over clan recognition, and she made that choice for you. Josie looked at the window. The courtyard below was dark, the horses shifting quietly in their stalls, breath visible in the cold air. She thought about her mother, small and precise and relentlessly capable. A woman who had built a life from almost nothing at the edge of Vornath territory, without ever explaining why she had come from nowhere, and never spoke of family. "She never told me," Josie said quietly. "I know." His voice had shifted slightly, still even, but with something underneath it that was not clinical. "I think she intended to. I think she ran out of time." The grief was not new. It was 3 years old and had been lived with long enough to be manageable. But it moved through her chest in a single wave at those words, clean and complete. She breathed through it. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Because she needed to ask it plainly, without softening the question, regardless of how the answer might land. Kyle was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the courtyard, and the torch nearest the window guttered and recovered. "The Vale bloodline has been absent from the wolf territories for 40 years, he said. "Its absence has created an imbalance in the founding structure that every pack elder has felt, and none has been able to name." He paused. "But that is not why I crossed the hall tonight." "Then why?" He looked at her with those pale gray eyes that did not perform and did not deflect. "Because from everything I have learned about you in 2 years, and from everything I observed in the 3 seconds you stood in that doorway tonight," he said, "you are exactly what a Luna should be. And I have been waiting a very long time to find exactly that." The corridor was very quiet. From the far window, Priya made a sound into her wine cup that she converted, with some effort, into a cough. Josie did not answer him immediately. She understood, in some instinctive and unlearned part of herself, that this was one of those moments that divided a life cleanly into before and after, and that the answer she gave deserved more than the breathless, unthinking yes that some younger, more desperate version of herself might have offered. The AlphaKing had crossed a hall full of witnesses and spoken her grandmother's bloodline name in a torchlit corridor, and every particle of that was extraordinary and overwhelming, and also, she reminded herself with deliberate care, entirely unverified by anything except his word. "I need time," she said. Something in Cale's expression settled, as though this answer satisfied him more than immediate agreement would have. "You have it," he said. "I don't mean tonight. I mean real time. Days. However long you need. And I want to see the archive record. The actual document. Not a summary. Not a description. The record itself. with the royal seal intact. I'll have it sent to Vornath's keep by tomorrow evening. And I want Preya included in whatever comes next. She's not a consequence of my circumstances that gets left behind. Done. Josie studied his face for signs of impatience or performance. She found neither. He looked like a man who had expected to be asked for exactly these things and had already considered giving them. You agree very easily for someone who rules an entire continent, she said. I agree easily because the requests are reasonable. A pause. I found that people who make reasonable requests and expect them to be honored without negotiation tend to be worth listening to. From down the corridor, Caden Voss's voice drifted with the studied innocence of a man who had been listening to every word. He's been practicing that line, by the way. I've heard it at least. Caden. Still quiet. Reth, near the entrance, turned his head fractionally toward Caden with an expression that communicated an entire paragraph of warning in the language of controlled stillness. Caden straightened slightly against the wall and found something interesting to examine on the ceiling. Josie looked at Cale one more time. This man with his braided dark hair and his scarred forearms and his eyes the color of winter sky, and made a decision that was not a full yes and not a no, and was, she thought, the most honest answer she had available. Tomorrow evening, then, she said, when the document arrives. He nodded once. Then, because he was apparently a man who understood when a conversation had reached its natural end, he turned and walked back toward the corridor entrance without pressing for more. He passed Reth, who fell into step behind him, and Caden, who pushed off the wall and followed with the air of someone very pleased with the evening's development. At the entrance, Cale paused without turning. The vestido, he said, and then corrected himself without embarrassment into the common tongue. The dress. It's well made. He walked back into the hall. Josie stood in the corridor for a moment with that sentence settling around her like something that had been thrown very accurately. Preya appeared at her elbow. So, Preya said. Don't. I'm not saying anything. You're saying everything. You're saying it very loudly without using words. I'm simply standing here, said Preya, in the corridor where the AlphaKing just spent 30 minutes explaining that you are the heir to one of the 7 founding bloodlines of the wolf world, and also that he has been researching you for 2 years, and also that your dress is well made. She sipped her wine. I'm not saying a single thing about any of that. The document arrived the following evening, as promised. It came wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with black wax, bearing the impression of the 2-toned wolf, the royal mark, unmistakable, the kind of seal that minor pack administrators went pale at the sight of. A royal courier delivered it to the Vornath guest room where Josie and Preya had been housed, handed it to Josie with the formality of someone delivering a matter of state, and left without speaking. Josie sat at the small table near the window and broke the seal. The document inside was old. Not ancient, but old in the way that things from 40 years prior are old when they have been kept in archival conditions. The parchment slightly stiff at the edges, the ink dark and settled, the handwriting the careful formal script of a royal record-keeper. It took her several minutes to parse the formal language, and Preya read over her shoulder in silence. The record was exactly what Cale had described. Her grandmother's name, Marin of Vielle, appeared at the top of the lineage document as the last registered clan holder of the Vielle bloodline, noted as dissolved from the central registry by her own declaration in the 40th year of the previous king's reign. A notation in a different hand, added later, read, Line presumed ended. No surviving issue confirmed. Beneath that, in handwriting that matched neither the original record nor the notation, someone had written 4 words in a smaller, more urgent script. Issue confirmed. Line continues. The ink of those 4 words was newer than the rest. Josie sat with the document for a long time. Josie, Preya said softly. I know. This is real. I know. You're not a no-name Omega from the borderlands. You never were. You're I'm still the same person who walked into that hall last night in a handmade dress, Josie said, and her voice was steady, but not entirely without feeling. A document doesn't change who I am. It changes what other people are allowed to know about who I am. Those are different things. Priya was quiet for a moment. Then, your mother knew. She carried this her whole life and never told you. She was protecting me. I know. I understand why. Priya sat down across from her. It still must hurt. It did. It was a specific, complicated hurt. Not anger at her mother, but grief at the weight her mother had carried alone, and grief at the years Josie had spent accepting a designation that had never been accurate, and something else underneath both of those that she didn't have a clean name for yet. The feeling of a floor turning out to be a ceiling. The vertigo of a world rearranged. She folded the document carefully and placed it back in the oilcloth. That afternoon, Kyle had sent word that he and his party would remain at Vornath Keep for 2 additional days, longer than a royal visit typically lasted, and long enough that every pack elder in the territory would understand it as a statement of intent. Josie had spent the morning aware of this information moving through the keep like water through cracks, filling every conversation, reshaping every interpretation of the previous night. Dorian Ashvale had looked at her differently at the morning meal. Not with remorse, exactly. He was not a man with enough self-awareness for clean remorse, but with a recalibrating attention that she found more irritating than the dismissal had been. Lord Ashenvale's daughter had noticed the recalibration and was noticeably displeased by it. Josie had eaten her bread and soft cheese and looked at neither of them. She met with Kyle that afternoon in the keep's library, a room that smelled of old leather and cedar oil, with shelves that reached the ceiling and a long oak table in the center. Reth stood outside the door. Caden had apparently been redirected elsewhere, which Josie suspected was deliberate. They sat across the table from each other, and Josie set the oilcloth document between them without speaking. You read it, Cale said. I did. And I believe it's genuine. She looked at him. I also believe that a man who has known about this for 2 years and waited for what he considered the right moment is a man with patience and strategy in approximately equal measure, and I want to know what the strategy is. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she was beginning to recognize. The particular stillness of someone who was genuinely thinking, rather than composing a performance of thinking. The wolf territories have been without a functioning Vial presence for 40 years, he said. The founding bloodlines exist for a reason beyond symbolism. They carry something. A quality of authority that alphas recognize instinctively. An ability to hold pack unity that no amount of political maneuvering fully replaces. My territory has been stable by force of will and careful governance. That works. But it is not the same as what it would be with all 7 bloodlines represented. And you need a Veil Luna to complete the structure, Josie said. I need a Luna who is Veil, yes. He paused. But I also need the specific person sitting across from me. Those are related, but not identical. You're going to have to explain that distinction. A woman of Veil blood who was raised in the high courts, trained for political maneuvering, taught to understand her own value as an instrument of alliance. She would serve the structural need, he said. But she would not be you. She would not have spent 23 years learning to hold her composure under conditions designed to make her feel invisible. She would not know what it costs to maintain dignity when the room has decided you don't deserve it. She would not understand the packs at the border, the people who live without clan names, the Omegas who are called standard designation, and mean nothing by it. Josie was quiet. A Luna who understands those people, Kyle continued, leads differently than one who only understands the court. I have enough people around me who understand the court. Outside the library windows, the late afternoon light was turning the stone walls amber. Josie looked at the document on the table between them, and at the man across from it, And she thought about her mother arriving at the borderlands alone and not speaking for 6 days. And she thought about 43 nights of candlelight. And she thought about 3 seconds in a doorway that she had tried very hard to explain away. "I'm not going to give you an answer today," she said. "I'm not asking for one today. But I want to walk the grounds. This evening, before the light goes." She met his eyes. "With you." It was a small thing to offer. She knew it was a small thing. But it was a real thing, extended deliberately rather than given by default. And something in the way he received it, the stillness of a man accepting something carefully, told her he understood the difference. "Then let's walk," he said. They walked the perimeter of the inner courtyard as the sun dropped behind the pine forests, the sky going copper and gray in alternating bands, their breath visible in the cooling air. They did not speak constantly. There were long stretches of comfortable quiet that Josie had not expected and found more telling than conversation. He pointed out, at one point, a crack in the outer wall near the north gate that had been poorly repaired and would need to be redone before winter. And she had said that the Borderlands cottages had the same problem, and that river clay mixed with ground limestone held better than mortar in cold climates. And he had looked at her with an expression she could not fully read, but did not find threatening. At the end of the walk, near the stable entrance where the smell of hay and horses drifted warm into the cooling evening, he stopped. "Tomorrow," he said, "there will be a formal acknowledgement before the assembled packs. I want to present the Vial record publicly and restore the clan designation." He looked at her. "That happens regardless of your answer about anything else. Your name belongs to you. It should be returned to you publicly, in the same space where it was publicly absent." Josie thought about the pack elder reading from a scroll in a flat voice. No clan affiliation. Standard designation. "Yes," she said. "I want that." He nodded. Then, after a pause that felt considered rather than accidental, "Your friend Preya. Does she have a designation she'd like corrected while we're correcting records?" Josie looked at him. "I'll ask her," she said, after a moment. The corner of his mouth moved. They walked back across the courtyard in the last of the copper light, and Josie was aware, with a clarity that was calm rather than dramatic, that something had changed in her that was not going to change back. The morning of the formal acknowledgement arrived with low clouds and the smell of coming rain. Josie stood at the window of her guest room while Preya braided her hair. Not the loose, simple plait she wore every day, but something more deliberate, the kind of braid that took time and intention, pulled back from her face with small sections woven tight at the crown, and the rest falling in a thick rope down her back. Preya worked in silence for most of it, which was unusual enough that Josie let it continue without comment. "He asked about my designation," Preya said finally, near the end. "I know. I told him to ask you directly." He did. Last evening, through Caden, which was a slightly chaotic method of communication, but effective. A pause, the sound of the braid being secured. "I told him my father was a blacksmith from the Vornath outer settlement, and my mother was a border Omega, and there wasn't anything to correct, designation-wise. I am what the scroll says I am." And he said that a blacksmith's daughter who had served as the primary emotional support and strategic counsel of a Vial heir for her entire adult life, without knowing it was a Vial heir, might consider whether she wanted a formal position that reflected that, rather than a designation that didn't. Preya's hands stilled briefly in Josie's hair. He used the word counsel, about me, without irony. "What did you say?" "I said I'd think about it." Preya resumed the final tucks of the braid. "I've been thinking about it since approximately the moment the words left my mouth, and I haven't stopped." She stepped around to look at Josie's face. "He's not performing, is he, when he says things?" "No," Josie said. "He isn't. That's either very reassuring or the most sophisticated long game in the history of wolf politics." "I know. Are you afraid?" Josie considered this honestly. Yes, she said. But not of him. I'm afraid of wanting something this much. I'm afraid of the version of me that counted 43 candle nights and stood in a hall waiting for a man who had already decided to look elsewhere. I don't want to be her again. Priya looked at her for a moment with the particular steadiness of someone who has known a person long enough to recognize the difference between what they say and what they mean. You're not her, Priya said. That woman was waiting to be chosen. You've spent the last 2 days deciding whether to choose back. Those aren't the same posture. Josie looked at her friend, copper-haired, green-eyed, in her best dress, which was still a modest thing by the standards of this hall, and felt the particular, uncomplicated gratitude of someone who understands exactly how much they owe to another person's steadiness. Thank you, she said. For all of it, not just today. Priya straightened and smoothed her skirt with the brisk efficiency of someone who found extended sentiment uncomfortable in the mornings. Obviously, she said. Now let's go restore your bloodline before I start crying and ruin the hair. The stone hall was full again. Word had moved through the keep overnight, as word always moved through packs, swiftly and with embellishment, and there were more wolves present at the morning assembly than had been at the mating ball itself. Pack elders stood near the front. The clan banner representatives had repositioned themselves. Lord Ashenvale was present with a carefully neutral expression that indicated he had spent the morning recalibrating his understanding of the previous 2 days. Dorian Ashvale stood beside his intended near the east wall, and Josie did not look at him when she entered, not because she was avoiding him, but because he had genuinely ceased to occupy significant space in her attention. Cale stood at the front of the hall near the great hearth. He had not dressed for ceremony in the way that pack leaders dressed for ceremony. No formal robes, no excessive insignia. He wore what he wore: the leather armor, the broad belts, the fur mantle, the sword. He stood with Reth at his left and Caden at his right, and Caden for once was not grinning. He looked, Josie thought, like someone who understood that this morning mattered. The pack elder of Vornath stood at the ceremonial position with his scroll, looking like a man who had been informed overnight that he was going to be part of a historical record and was not entirely comfortable with the responsibility. Josie walked to the front of the hall. She was aware of every eye in the room, and she let herself be aware of it without flinching. She had spent 23 years learning to be invisible in rooms like this one. She was done with that particular skill. Cale looked at her when she reached the front, and the look was brief and direct and said, without words, exactly what it needed to say. He turned to address the hall. The vile bloodline, he said, in the carrying voice of a man accustomed to being heard in large spaces, was recorded as ended 40 years ago by an administrative decision that was, in the plainest terms, wrong. The woman who held that clan designation chose to dissolve her own record rather than surrender it to a consolidation order. She was not without issue. She had a daughter, and that daughter had a daughter, and that daughter is standing in this hall. The silence in the room was different from the silence of the previous night. That silence had been the silence of surprise. This one was the silence of comprehension, of a large number of people simultaneously understanding that the story they had been told about the shape of the world was missing a piece. The veil designation is hereby restored, Cale continued, by royal authority, effective immediately, with full clan rights, ancestral recognition, and all attendants standing within the pack structure of the wolf territories. He turned to the pack elder, who had his scroll open with hands that were not entirely steady. Record it. The elder recorded it. The scratch of the quill on parchment was audible in the quiet. Josie of Vale, the elder read back, in a voice that was less flat than his voice the previous evening, as though the words themselves had required him to adjust his register. Clan holder of the restored Vale bloodline, full designation confirmed. Josie heard the words land in the hall and felt them land in her chest simultaneously, not as triumph, which would have felt cheap, but as something quieter, and more durable. Correction. The simple, profound satisfaction of a true thing being said aloud after a long time of being unsaid. From somewhere in the middle of the hall, she heard Preya make the sound she had been trying not to make since morning. Then Kale turned back to face her, and the hall went quiet again in a different way, because every wolf present understood that the formal acknowledgement had been one part of what was happening this morning, and that this was the other part. "I told you 2 days ago," he said, and his voice was lower now, not performing for the hall but speaking to her, "that I was not standing in front of you by accident." He reached into the leather satchel at Reth's feet. Reth handed it to him with the gravity of a man who understood the weight of objects, and produced a circlet. It was not elaborate. Silver-gray metal, simply worked, with a single detail at the crown. A small carved wolf, two-toned, black and white. The Luna's circlet. The mark of the AlphaKing's chosen. "And I told you that you were exactly what a Luna should be. I haven't changed my assessment." The hall was utterly still. "I'm not placing this on your head," he said. "I'm offering it. There is a difference, and the difference matters to me." The pale eyes held hers with a directness that was not pressure, but simply honesty, undecorated. "You've had 2 days, and you asked for time, and I gave it. I'm asking now. Not as a king, as the wolf who has been waiting to find you for 2 years, and intends, if you'll allow it, to spend considerably longer than that, making sure you never stand in another doorway, trying to leave a room you deserve to be the center of." The silence stretched for one full breath. Josie thought about her mother, about the sealed archive and the 4 words written in urgent ink, about 43 nights of candlelight that had been sewn into a dress that had turned out to be worth wearing after all, only not for the reason she had originally believed. She thought about the 3 seconds in the doorway. She thought about river clay and limestone, and the way a man could walk in silence beside a person and make the silence feel like something built rather than something empty. "Yes," she said. "I'll allow it." Something crossed Kale's face that she had not seen there before. A brief, complete openness, unguarded, there and then controlled again within a single breath, but real enough that she caught it and held it in her memory like the small hard weight of a dried clove in a pocket. He stepped forward and placed the circlet on her head with both hands, carefully, as though the object mattered, and so did she. The hall responded, not in the wild, erupting way of entertainment, but in the low, resonant sound of 200 wolves acknowledging something true. It moved through the room like a current, a collective exhale, the sound of a structure that had been incomplete for 40 years, settling into its correct shape. Caden Voss, to his credit, managed to hold his composure for nearly 4 full seconds before he said something quietly triumphant to Reth, who ignored him with the precision of long practice. In the weeks that followed, Josie moved from the borderlands to the royal keep in the Northern Territory, and Preya came with her, not as a servant or a companion in the diminished sense, but as the formal counsel to the Luna, a position that Kale created with the same practical directness he applied to everything, and that Preya accepted with the brisk efficiency of someone who had always, in fact, been doing the job. The Viel clan designation was entered into the Central Archives with full historical restoration. 3 other border Omegas who had been incorrectly designated were identified and corrected in the same administrative review. It was a quiet change, recorded in documents rather than announced in halls, and Josie thought it was more important for that. Dorian Ashvale married Lord Ashenvale's daughter in the autumn. The alliance between the 2 packs proved moderately useful and entirely unremarkable. Josie heard about it the way one hears about weather in distant territories, noted, understood, and left entirely without weight. Reth remained Reth, still, watchful, communicating volumes through the precise calibration of his silences. He was, Josie eventually concluded, one of the most genuinely loyal people she had ever encountered, which made his apparent incapacity for warmth a matter of style rather than character. Caden Voss was exactly what he had appeared to be from the beginning, and was somehow improved by this consistency. Cale was, in the private architecture of a shared life, what he had been in the corridor and on the walk and across the library table: direct, unhurried, a man who paid attention as a primary form of care. He did not perform affection. He demonstrated it through the accumulation of small, specific things: the correct document sent without being asked, the silence that was presence rather than absence, the memory of details she had mentioned once and not repeated. He learned that she preferred the morning quiet before speaking. She learned that he processed difficulty through physical work and long solitary walks, and that the appropriate response to this was to let him, and to be there after. They were not a perfect thing. They were a true thing, which was better. On the first anniversary of the mating ball, Josie stood at the window of the royal keep and looked out at the pine forest that stretched to the horizon in every direction, dark and ancient and enormous under a sky thick with stars, and felt, with a completeness that asked for no further addition, that she had arrived somewhere real. Not somewhere she had been given. Somewhere she had chosen. The circlet sat on the small table beside her, its carved wolf catching the candlelight. She picked it up, turned it once in her hands, and set it back down. Behind her, Cale came in from the corridor and stopped when he saw her at the window, and did not speak, because he understood, as he had always seemed to understand, when silence was the right language. He crossed the room and stood beside her. Outside, somewhere deep in the pine forest, a wolf called into the dark. Neither of them needed to answer it. They were already home.